Cheerilee settled into the province corner for the third time that night. Her stomach rumbled and her throat was dry. In hindsight, she should have probably put some popcorn and water there, but it was far too late for that now. With a sigh, she turned her attention to the stage, and just let her mind wander to the rhythm of the story for a while. "No! My decision is final! You will have to go!" the king screamed at Sir Altreus, who returned his indignant glances with worried looks. "But my king, the royal guard, they are needed to defend the capital. With tensions rising to the east, we have no ponies to spare. You know this, Altreus. I trust you in your capabilities. You will not fail me, like the others have. For if you do, I'll have to accept this cretin's challenge myself." The king sighed, and the weight of the situation apparently suddenly pressing down upon his shoulders. Altreus, seeing his king's troubles echoed on his face, fell silent and simply nodded. Without a further word, the knight turned around and walked away, leaving the confines of the royal court and heading down Reginald's part of the stage. The two fillies played their parts so well, it was easy to forget they were playing it at all, even for Cheerilee. Applebloom had shown an almost single-minded dedication to the script, and knowing it as thoroughly as she did, obviously allowed her to concentrate on other aspects of acting. The words came on their own. Sweetie Belle had been less diligent, but she possessed a way with words and vocalization that made her a natural actor, although Cheerilee ventured to guess that singing was probably more her style. It was somewhat ironic that they both find their end doing something that they were at least moderately competent at, while they were otherwise pretty much a waste of space. But Cheerilee was careful not to equate a single useful skill to being a worthwhile individual. The play had fallen into a familiar pattern at that point, Sir Altreus beginning the third attempt to finally put a stop to Reginald the Sly. Sweetie Belle, like the other three before her, started to make her way to the other side of the stage, although she clearly wasn't aiming to get to the mountain that Scootaloo had disappeared into, or the house the other two fillies had found. Instead, she resolutely headed to the forest at the far end of the stage, that is to say, to the few cardboard trees that together gave the impression of a forest. She quickly reached her destination, and as the lights above that part of the stage were turned on, it became clear that some pony was already there waiting for Sir Altreus. The audience wasn't very surprised when it became clear that it was Reginald once again, but the bear trap around his back leg, which he couldn't seem to get out of, was certainly an unforeseen twist. The knight approached carefully, but Reginald inevitably picked up his hoof steps before too long and craned his neck to look around. "Well, well. Seems at least one of us has been in luck today. The great knight arriving during the villain's finest hour. You must be thrilled," he said bitterly, wincing slightly. Altreus said nothing for a few moments. "Are you hurt?" he finally asked. The villainous pony laughed and shook his head, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Oh no! This thing is very comfortable, in fact." "I'll get you out," the knight responded as he stepped forward. "But if you make one strange move—" He never got to finish his sentence, as suddenly something caught around his hind legs, and the world flopped upside down. Before the knight realized what was happening, he was hanging down from the ceiling by his hooves. To the audience, however, it appeared as if he was hanging from one of the cardboard trees. "Hey! Let me down!" Reginald cackled maniacally as he opened the clamp around his leg, revealing it to be an impressive fake, but nothing more than that. He casually strolled over to the captured knight, and mockingly gave him a little push, making Sweetie Belle swing around slightly. "Ah, dear Sir Altreus, is it not? Not one for sulking about, are we?" You'd have to be quite good not to be spotted by me, anyway. And that legendary kindness, who knew it'd get you into the position you are in now? He laughed again, giving the knight another push to keep him swinging. If you know what's good for you, Reginald, you'll come with me. The king is fed up, and whatever his next move may be, you'll probably not like it if you stick around here, Ultrius replied, holding onto as much dignity as he could, whilst upside down and swinging around. I've heard the same tale spun twice before, good stallion. I'm quite sick of it by now. So, if you don't mind, this'll be goodbye. Say hello to the beasts of the underworld for me, the sly sneered as he pulled one of the omnipresent hidden levers, one that had been concealed behind the tree. The floor opened and the rope was released all at once, sending the filly screaming down into a now open hatch in the floor, as the lights faded and Reginald disappeared off screen. Sweetie Belle saw the floor rapidly approach, and panic coiled around her like a snake. Weren't there supposed to be mattresses here? With a thud, she hit the ground, and as she lay there motionless, she didn't have to think about anything else for a while. When she came to, she was in a dimly lit room, lying on a table of some description. She felt a nasty bump on her head, throb painfully to the rhythm of her heartbeat. But when she tried to touch it with one of her hooves, she realized her front legs had been tied above her head with rope, while her hind legs were bound on the other side. The ropes were keeping her stretched out as much as possible, and it was more than a little uncomfortable. It also felt as if the table had a large hole in it, right underneath the middle of her back, but she couldn't, for the life of her, figure out why. Her first thought was that she had probably hit her head harder than she'd thought, and that this was all a hallucination, or some sort of dream. But if it was a mighty convincing one at that. She tried looking around the room, but there was only a single weak lamp right above her, and she couldn't see much. Suddenly, she imagined seeing something move in the shadows, a shape that broke the monotony of immobile shadows with a deeper kind of darkness. Is some pony there? The filly said, shaking. Applebloom and Scootaloo had told her more than a few scary stories during their camping trips, and an unnerving amount of them started off just like this. She sighed in relief as Cheerilee stepped into the light. Oh, Teach! I hit my head, and I don't know where we were, so could you please? She begged, nodding her head towards the ropes. Her white skin grew even paler than usual when she realized Cheerilee was carrying a hammer in her mouth. She didn't know why that freaked her out all of a sudden, but there was something in Cheerilee's eyes. Miss? She squeaked weakly. Cheerilee's only response was to lift up one of her hooves, revealing her to be wearing another one of those special work pony shoes, not unlike the one she'd used to hold the chisel. This one had a far smaller hole, though, and the circle wasn't completely closed off. It was designed to hold nails, while still being able to slip the shoe off the nail through the opening, once the job was almost done. What are you? Sweetie Belle began, but she cut herself off with a scream as Cheerilee let her actions speak for her, hammering a nail diagonally into the filly's right hoof and through her heel until it got stuck in the wooden table below her. She felt a trickle of warm blood coat the nail and bit her lip as she struggled to keep calm, for she knew simply attempting to pull her hoof away now would cause even more damage, and more importantly, pain. Not that the ropes currently offered her much freedom of movement, but she didn't want to take any risks. With tears in her eyes, she tried pleading with Cheerilee again. Completely bewildered by this recent chain of events, her mind raced to figure out what was going on. How could she wake up from this nightmare? Please stop. What have I... the filly whimpered. Cheerilee just smiled sweetly, as best she could, with the hammer between her teeth, as she prepared another nail, this time putting it against the filly's other hoof. The mare looked Sweetie Belle in the eyes, intently for a moment, making sure she knew exactly what was coming to her. Sweetie Belle whimpered and swallowed back a new burst of tears before crying out, "No! Help! Sis! Rarity! Any pony!" But no pony came, or replied, let alone to come to her rescue, as Cheerilee hammered down for the second time, driving the nail through the filly's hoof and into the table with just a few well-aimed hits. Sweetie Belle squeaked in pain as she tried her best to keep still, the necessity of remaining still weighing down on her as heavily as the pain itself. She kinda understood the concept behind walking it off a lot better now, as she'd have given anything to be able to do just that. She sobbed as Cheerilee ducked down to retrieve another nail and walking around to the other side of the table. "No, please, no!" the white-coated filly sobbed, letting a new, desperate cry out as Cheerilee started nailing one of her front legs down, before quickly doing the same to the other as well. Sweetie Belle could feel pain radiating through each of her legs, but for her tormentor, it still wasn't enough. Unaffected by the filly's crying and pleading, she continued on and drove a second nail through each of the filly's legs, this time straight through the ankle just above the hooves itself. Little pools of blood started to form around her hooves, flowing off the edge of the table and dripping down to the ground lazily. In the heat of the moment, Cheerilee dropped the hammer and tentatively held her tongue underneath one of the little streams, savoring the taste of Sweetie Belle's warm blood as it dripped into her mouth. It tasted even better than Scootaloo's had, perhaps because it hadn't had much time to cool down yet. The filly was still crying softly as Cheerilee rummaged about, retrieving one of several machines she had stored in the room. She struck it against a nearby wall and bowed her head down to light the fire underneath a metal cylinder that reached up from just above the floor to the table itself, connected to the table in the spot where Sweetie Belle had felt a hole in the wood earlier. The little bits of wood and tinder the mare had prepared for this occasion caught on fire quickly and continued burning nicely, smoke circling up to hang just underneath the ceiling. Cheerilee looked up at it, but wasn't too worried. The room was badly ventilated, but it was a small fire, and she wouldn't need it that much longer, in any case. A minute or two passed, and Cheerilee just memorized the small flames as she waited, thinking of the fun she'd had with snails earlier. The white filly slowly stopped crying, sniffling pathetically as she looked at Cheerilee with teary eyes, confused by the mare's actions, but hopefully that this pause meant she was reconsidering her, keeping her there against her will. "Please, miss, if you let me go, I won't tell any pony. I promise," she managed to say with a trembling lip, but again Cheerilee neglected to respond. Suddenly, Sweetie Belle became aware of a panicked squeaking noise coming from somewhere in the room. The sound increased in intensity steadily, until it sounded like a great many rats were fearing for their lives somewhere, even though that didn't seem to make any sense. She had some trouble locating the source of the noise, until suddenly she realized it was coming from underneath the table, from the thing Cheerilee was staring at, but she could not see it. As her teacher stepped closer to the table, she mentally recoiled, but the mare simply leaned in and reached underneath the table itself, grabbing hold of a metal plate at the top of the cylinder with her teeth and pulling it out, removing the last barrier between the cylinder and the hole underneath Sweetie Belle. In doing so, the squeaking quickly escalated to unpredictable levels, but still Sweetie Belle couldn't make heads nor tails of it. What did rats have to do with a metal plate? Then suddenly, the filly gasped and her eyes grew wide with fear as she felt dozens of little claws scratch at her back, as the entrapped rats surged up from the overheated cylinder to find a way to escape the flames. Even in their frenzied state, they recognized the difference in hardness between their metal prison and the filly's tender flesh. And they were fully prepared to put some effort into clawing a way out, even if that meant living to squeak another day. Many mouths and claws worked together as they started to gnaw and tear at the filly's back, her terrified screams of pain not managing to extract any mercy from the swarm of vermin. She tried arching up her back to lift it out of their reach, which would also have set them free, but her body stretched to its limits and held firmly in place by the ropes and nails. She couldn't even lift it a tenth of an inch. The rats quickly ripped away patches of her coat and skin, relentlessly going on to gnaw at her flesh. The filly screamed as she thrashed her head around from side to side, unable to do anything else as the rats started to devour her alive, piece by piece. Like a well-oiled digging implement, they ripped and tugged at her muscles and ligaments, tearing out sinew and arteries, both as they pushed onwards. Several of them came face to face with her spine, but decided to simply gnaw around it when it proved to be a nut too hard to crack. After all, they were aiming to break free and didn't have a bone to pick with any of the elements that made up Sweetie's body in particular. The filly herself shrieked like a banshee, foam appearing on her mouth as her muscles convulsed and her body thrashed about as much as it could, which was not to say much at all. Regardless of that, she still moved enough for the nails to pull at the wounds they had inflicted on her, causing the holes to become larger and bleed even more profusely. But this, although painful, was only the least of her troubles, as the rats' combined efforts finally broke through her layers of skin and muscle as they erupted into her abdomen cavity, clawing up past her intestines, or in some case, simply gnawing through them. The unpleasant and torturous feeling soon turned Sweetie Belle green with nausea as her stomach buckled and she vomited, partially managing to spray it next to her on the table, but some of it getting onto herself, as she could only barely lift her head to aim it away. The ensuing screams were music to Cheerilee's ears, and when copious amounts of blood started streaming out of the bottom of the metal cylinder, falling down onto the fire with a hiss, her legs got all wobbly with excitement. As the rats continued to bite and claw their way through Sweetie Belle, her screaming slowly shifted into a wet gurgling noise. With every passing second, more of her internal organs got ripped to shreds as the disoriented rats tried to find a way out. A few of them stayed right on target as they started advancing into the upper part of the filly's abdomen, opposite to the point where they had entered. Some of the rats were clueless, though, and they kept going through and around in circles, or starting off on completely wrong ways, digging horizontal tunnels of gore through Sweetie Belle. As one of the rats tore through her diaphragm, the filly's breathing became shallow and troubled, and Cheerilee started taking up bets with herself as to what would kill the filly first, the loss of blood or the inevitable destruction of some vital organ or the other. It wasn't long after that the filly's stomach started to bulge out, before suddenly a blood-soaked rat tore its way through the last patch of skin with his sharp claws and poked his head out of her stomach. To Cheerilee, the small, furry creature was the most adorable thing she'd ever seen in quite some time, especially the way it looked around the room with curious eyes. It clawed its way fully out of Sweetie Belle's warm entrails and made its way down her quivering body and off the table, soon followed by a dozen of his brethren as they all fled their meaty container and scurried off into darkness. The pale filly's body convulsed so wildly with shock that not even the ropes were enough to hold her down anymore. She thrashed and shook against her bindings as a stream of bloody gore flowed out of her mouth and down her chin, nails ripping through flesh, or simply getting pulled out of the table altogether. After a few violent seconds, during which most of the rats escaped, all the nails had ripped either through her flesh or her hoof, or both. but the filly was already far too gone to notice or care. Her body convulsed one last time, and she let out a horrifying choking sound when the filly finally passed away. In the ensuing silence, the only thing that could still be heard was the dripping of blood and Cheerilee's heavy panting, since the blood flowing out of the cylinder had long since extinguished the crackling flames the mare had lit earlier. A few moments passed, during which Cheerilee tried to control the trembling of her body, until suddenly a soft squeaking noise could be heard. The reason for Sweetie Belle's choking sounds towards the end became at once apparent as her mouth opened and one of the rats forced its way out of her throat, climbing past her teeth to freedom. Cheerilee burst out at once into hysterical laughter, still in the throes of hilarity, when she took the stairs back to get to the fillies and colts' dressing area. All the way up there, only one question was on her mind. Why had no comedian ever thought of this before? Death was simply hysterical.